in order to finance the US economy. If this financing stopped, then the US economy could face collapse. And this means that these young men could not afford their OnlyFans anymore, and this could lead to a revolution in the streets. So the consequences for America would be dire if America were to retreat from the Middle East.
What is going on, everybody? Lucas Stowe here. And listen, I need you to pay close attention to this one because this interview starts in one place and ends somewhere completely different. And you need to be ready for both stops on that journey. This is Piers Morgan Uncensored. The guest is Professor Jiang Xueqin, game theorist, predictive analyst, and the man who in 2024 told the world that Trump would win the presidency, that Trump would go to war with Iran, and that the United States would lose that war. Two of those three have already happened. The third one is playing out in real time right now. So when this man sits down with Piers and starts breaking down how Iran is strangling the global economy, why the GCC nations are one bad week away from an existential crisis, and why sending ground troops into Iran would be another Vietnam, you need to take that seriously. This is not a pundit guessing. This is a track record talking. But then the interview takes a turn, and that turn is going to make some of you uncomfortable, and it is going to make some of you want to dismiss everything he said before it. Do not do that. Because the ability to separate the credible analysis from speculative theory is exactly the kind of critical thinking this channel is built for. If you're not subscribed yet, right now is the moment, because this is precisely the kind of conversation that most channels will either hype up entirely or bury completely. Hit that subscribe button, stay with me, and let us get into it.
Jiang is a game theorist, best known for his popular predictive history YouTube channel, where he applies his systems of analysis to the past in order to predict the future. Back in 2024, he predicted that Trump would win the presidency, that Trump would go to war with Iran, and that the US would lose that war. This has sparked a flurry of interest in both his work and his rather colourful adjacent opinions. Professor Jiang joins me now. Professor Jiang, thank you very much indeed for joining me on Uncensored.
Hi, Piers.
Let me start with these three big predictions, because you've been proven obviously completely right about two of them, and the third one is now unfurling before our eyes. Are you confident that you'll be proven right with the third prediction, that Iran ultimately will prevail in this war?
Right. So right now, the United States and Iran are fighting a war of attrition. The United States is trying to degrade Iran's military capacity, and Iran is trying to strangle the world economy. And it turns out that Iran is putting a lot of pressure on the GCC. And I think at the end of the day, the United States will be compelled to send ground forces. Once the United States sends in ground forces, there's no turning back. It's all in. The sunk cost fallacy kicks in. It'll be another Vietnam for the United States because Iran is a mountain fortress. And the United States right now doesn't have the manpower, the manufacturing capacity, and the political will to fight a long war of attrition on the ground in Iran.
Right. So I think because of what you've said at the end there, it's highly unlikely that Trump would commit ground forces because he's always pledged not to. And I think he would see the inherent danger of that. So if he doesn't commit ground forces, how do you see this war playing out?
Well, right now, if Trump doesn't commit ground troops, he does have a variety of options. The first option is just to simply declare victory and call it a day. Unfortunately, the problem with that is that US bases are still exposed, the GCC economies are still under pressure, the Strait of Hormuz is still closed, and there are no signs that Iran is interested in peace negotiations. Iran feels as though it has the upper hand because it has the political will and the resources to draw this war out. Now, let's assume that Trump does withdraw from the Middle East. Then what happens is that the GCC nations of Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Qatar, Kuwait, UAE now are forced to pay a ransom to Iran because they supply the world with their oil through the Strait of Hormuz. 20% of the world's oil flows through the Strait of Hormuz. But in return, they get food. So the GCC nations import anywhere from 80 to 90% of their food from overseas. And so basically the center of gravity shifts from the petrodollar to whatever financial system that Iran wants to focus on. And it could be BRICS, it could be gold, it could be anything. But remember, the problem with that is that the US economy is a Ponzi scheme. It's dependent on the GCC investing in AI and tech stocks, in startups like Uber in order to finance the US economy. If this financing stopped, then the US economy could face collapse. And this means that these young men could not afford their OnlyFans anymore, and this could lead to a revolution in the streets. So the consequences for America would be dire if America were to retreat from the Middle East.
I mean, it seems that the key part of all this sort of economic strangulation, if you like, by Iran is the Strait of Hormuz. We've already seen in the last few hours today that the successor to Ayatollah Khomeini, his son, has come out. Apparently, we haven't seen him or heard from him directly, but there's a statement in which he talks about keeping the Strait of Hormuz closed indefinitely. If that was to happen, what would be the consequences for the global economy, and how soon would we see those consequences?
Well, I mean, the consequences would be dire because cheap energy, cheap petroleum products are the very basis of the global modern economy. So it just wouldn't be jet fuel that would be affected. It would also be food, because remember, food is produced by fertilizer, which comes from the GCC, as well as sulfuric acid, which helps the process of some semiconductor production. So artificial intelligence, food production, global travel are all dependent on products from the GCC. It's only been 2 weeks that the Strait of Hormuz has been closed for almost 2 weeks now, and already we're seeing high oil prices surpassing $100 a barrel. Iran says that they want to move it to $20 a barrel, which signals that they want the Strait of Hormuz closed for months. Now remember, even if Iran were to open up the Strait of Hormuz, it would take weeks before oil production continues. So I think for the global economy, I think we've reached the point of no return. And in the future, global economies have to commit to a bit of deindustrialization and even mercantilism in order to survive future shocks. So if you go to Southeast Asia, Vietnam and Thailand have already ordered the government workers to work from home in order to save fuel.
You've pointed out that the Gulf Cooperation Council monarchies, the GCC, as you've alluded to several times here, are structurally unusual states because they're propped up by oil, desalination. They don't have their own water supply naturally, and American protection. You say correctly, they were built in open desert with no food security, as you said, 80% imported, no water security, the desalination dependency, no geographic defenses, they're flat, exposed terrain, no demographic cohesion. In places like Dubai, for example, 90% of the population are expats, and no independent security architecture reliant on the US, who have bases, obviously, in many of the states there. If you put all this together, is what's happening now, in terms of the tactics that Iran are deploying, including the threats to desalination, but also targeting, obviously, targeted hotels and airports and so on, going to the heart of what the states there would like to see as the future of their economy, which is tourism, sport, entertainment, clearly designed to scare people away from that. Is this now representing an existential threat, do you think, to the business model of the GCC states going forward?
Right. So the most vulnerable city and often the most glamorous city in the GCC is Dubai. And for many years, Dubai has been very successful in cultivating an image as the new city of London, as the new Hong Kong of the Middle East. And thousands of these millionaires flock to Dubai for the glamorous lifestyle as well as the tax-free aspect of the city. But the reality is that this was all premised on global peace, on Pax Americana, on the capacity of America to project power all around the world and provide security guarantees to the GCC. Now this aura of inevitability and invincibility of American empire has been shattered. And once an illusion is shattered, there's actually no coming back from this. And that's what people don't really appreciate about this war. This war is not just directed at Israel. This war is not directed just at the GCC and the illusion of American empire. This war is directed at American empire itself. And what people don't appreciate is the eschatological aspects of this war, in that Iran sees a moral duty, a moral imperative from God to destroy the great Satan, which is the American empire. And the base of the American empire, of course, is the global economy.
Right. At the heart and the head of the American economy is the President of the United States. You've argued that Trump is not the most powerful person in America, and you've inferred that actually the real power base is Israel. Explain that.
Right. So I actually don't say the real power base is Israel. What I say is that the real power base are a collection of secret societies that have an eschatological view of this war. And these secret societies include the Freemasons, which are now called the Rosicrucians and the Knights Templars. They include Jewish organizations called the Sephardim Frankists, who are embedded in religious movements called Shabbat Lubavitch. And then you have the Jesuits. You have a collection of secret societies. And they believe that a war in the Middle East would start a process that would culminate in the end times and the return of Jesus, the arrival of the Jewish Messiah, the building of a one world government. They have different eschatologies, but a lot of their time frames do align. So where they converge is that there has to be a war in the Middle East to kick things off. This war in the Middle East will lead to the defeat of the American empire, and this will lead to the culmination of the Greater Israel Project, where Israel is able to control the Middle East from the Nile to the Euphrates. Once the Greater Israel Project is in place, it will transform into the Pax Judaica, which is an AI surveillance state. This will eventually lead to the war of Gog and Magog, the destruction of the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the building of the Third Temple, the return of the Jewish diaspora to Jerusalem, and the arrival of the Jewish Messiah or the Antichrist. So they have the scripted out. And unfortunately, a lot of world events are conforming to this script.
Right. I mean, a lot of people say a lot of what you've just said is a load of fantastical baloney and driven by anti-Semitic tropes. What do you say to that?
Look, I completely sympathize with this argument. 5 years ago, I would have said the same thing about this sort of argument and thinking. So what I do is predictive modeling, okay? Meaning that I'm going to throw some theories out there. And then based on these theories, I'm going to extrapolate into the future and see what the predictions are. If these predictions are correct, then my theories ought to have some legitimacy. Now, when I teach, I don't engage in historical analysis. I engage in speculative analysis. And so in 2024, 2 years ago, I did say that this war in Iran would happen, and I provided a lot of my analysis. And a part of my analysis that's very important is the eschatological analysis, meaning that Christian Zionists control the United States. There's a preacher called John Hagee who runs an organization called Christians United for Israel, which has about 7 million members. Christian Zionists are heavily embedded in the national security apparatus and in the Pentagon. There's reporting that U.S. commanders have told their troops that this is a war to bring back Jesus and to be not afraid. So that's my argument. Like, I don't want to believe this, but because this war in Iran is happening, I'm forced to conclude that some of my speculative analysis has validity. Otherwise, it's...
A man predicted Trump wins the presidency, predicted Trump goes to war with Iran, predicted the United States loses that war. He got the first two right before most people even took them seriously. And now we're sitting here watching the third one unfold in real time. That is not luck. That is not a coincidence. That deserves your full attention. So let us start with the analysis that holds up, because there is a lot of it and it is important. The war of attrition framing is exactly right. Professor Jiang lays it out cleanly. The United States is trying to degrade Iran's military capacity from the air. Iran is trying to strangle the world economy through the Strait of Hormuz. And right now, Iran is winning that exchange, because degrading a mountain fortress from the air has never worked in the history of modern warfare, and strangling 20% of the world's oil supply works immediately and visibly. You do not need a PhD to see which pressure is landing harder. The ground forces argument is where it gets really serious. Jiang says if Trump commits ground troops, it becomes another Vietnam. And he's not being dramatic, he's being precise. Iran is not a flat desert you can roll tanks across. It is a mountainous country of 90 million people with a government that has spent decades preparing for exactly this scenario. The United States right now does not have the manufacturing capacity, the manpower, or the political will to sustain a long ground war in that terrain. Trump knows this. His base knows this, which is why the pressure to declare victory and walk away is going to intensify with every week this drags on. But here is the trap Jiang identifies that nobody is talking about loudly enough. You cannot just declare victory and walk away, because the moment you do, the GCC nations are exposed. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain. These are countries that import 80 to 90% of their food from overseas. They have no independent water supply. They have no geographic defenses. Their entire security architecture was built on the assumption that America would always be there to protect them. That assumption has now been shattered, and you cannot unshatter it. Once the aura of American invincibility is gone, it does not come back. That is not pessimism. That is history. And then there is the petrodollar conversation, which is the one that should be keeping people in Washington up at night. Professor Jiang makes a point that most mainstream media will not touch directly. The United States economy is structurally dependent on GCC nations recycling their oil wealth into American assets, tech stocks, AI investments, startups, treasury bonds. That is the engine. If the center of gravity shifts from the petrodollar to BRICS or gold or whatever financial architecture Iran decides to anchor to, that engine starts breaking down. And it does not break down slowly and politely. It breaks down in ways that ordinary Americans feel immediately and painfully. Higher prices, tighter credit, a cost of living crisis that makes the last few years look mild. The people at the bottom absorb that first and hardest. They always do. Now Dubai. This one is worth sitting with. For years, Dubai has cultivated this image of itself as the glamorous, invincible, tax-free playground of the global elite. Thousands of millionaires relocated there precisely because it felt permanent and protected. Jiang is right that this was always an illusion built on Pax Americana, on the guarantee that American power would keep the region stable enough for that lifestyle to exist. Iran targeting hotels and airports and desalination infrastructure is not random. It is surgical. It is going directly at the business model. And once the illusion of safety in a place like Dubai is broken, the money leaves and it does not come back. That is an existential threat to the GCC business model, and nobody in Western media is saying it plainly enough. Now we need to talk about the second half of this interview, because this is where Lucas Stowe has to be straight with you. Professor Jiang pivots from credible geopolitical analysis into secret societies, Freemasons, Jesuits, Sabbatean Frankists, a scripted eschatological roadmap toward the Third Temple and a one-world government. And Piers Morgan, to his credit, calls it what it is. Fantastical baloney driven by anti-Semitic tropes. And on that specific point, Piers is not wrong. Here is the thing. The moment you start organizing your analysis around the idea that a network of secret societies is scripting world events toward a predetermined end times conclusion, you have left the realm of predictive modeling and entered the realm of conspiracy theory. And conspiracy theory is dangerous, not because it is always entirely wrong, but because it is structured to be unfalsifiable. Everything confirms the theory. Nothing can disprove it. That is not analysis. That is a closed loop. Now Jiang defends himself by saying his track record gives his speculative theories legitimacy. And this is where I need you to think carefully. A correct prediction does not validate every theory that fed into it. A broken clock is right twice a day. If I predict a hurricane hits Florida and I'm right, that does not mean my theory about why the hurricane happened is correct. The prediction and the underlying theory are separate things, and they need to be evaluated separately. Jiang was right about Trump. He was right about the war. Those predictions can stand on their own based on solid structural analysis of political incentives, military capacity, and economic pressure. They do not need Freemasons to explain them. The Christian Zionist point, however, deserves a separate treatment because that one is not conspiracy. That one is documented. John Hagee's Christians United for Israel has 7 million members. Christian Zionist ideology is genuinely embedded in the national security apparatus and the Pentagon. There are credible reports of military commanders framing this conflict in explicitly religious terms to their troops. That is real. That is not secret. That is a publicly documented influence network operating in plain sight. You can acknowledge that without endorsing the fully scatological script Jiang is building around it. So here is where Lucas Stowe lands on this. Professor Jiang is one of the most analytically sharp voices on the structural dynamics of this war. The war of attrition framework, the GCC vulnerability, the petrodollar threat, the Vietnam parallel. All of it is grounded, serious, and important. But when he crosses into secret society eschatology, he loses the thread. And the danger is that the people who need to hear the credible part will dismiss all of it because of the conspiratorial part. Do not let that happen in your own thinking. Take what holds up. Scrutinize what does not. That is the job. What is clear, regardless of where you land on Professor Jiang's theories, is this. The Strait of Hormuz is closed. Oil is already past $100 a barrel and Iran wants it at $200. The GCC is structurally exposed in ways that have never been tested like this before. The American empire's aura of invincibility has taken a hit it cannot simply walk back from. And a man with a track record of getting the big calls right is telling you Iran wins this. That should not make you comfortable regardless of your politics, because the people who pay the price when empires miscalculate are never the architects of the miscalculation. They are the ones already struggling, already squeezed, already one economic shock away from the edge. Stay informed, stay critical, stay engaged. Because the decisions being made right now in Washington, in Tehran, in Riyadh, and in Dubai are going to shape the next decade of life for ordinary people around the world. And you deserve to understand what is actually happening and why. If this channel is giving you that, subscribe right now, share this video with somebody who needs to hear it, and keep showing up. I am Lucas Stowe, and I will see you in the next one.